Hey everyone, Praetorian here. I want to let you know that your two-way radios are potentially susceptible to passive detection. I'm a YouTube newjack, so the exposure will be low, but hopefully not as low as simply leaving comments to the same effect, or creating some private blog to disseminate the information. Perhaps we can simply hijack the algorithm. I've sat on this information for a little while, debating whether or not I should even try to inject it into the conversation. However, I feel that this is information that may be relevant enough that it needs to be heard and further investigated by the group. There's a lot of discussion surrounding operational security and the use of communications equipment, particularly on a small unit scale. S2 Underground has released excellent content in that vein, and more recently, Chrisky has entered the chat with the intention to disruptively educate as much as he can while he too improves his own knowledge. I appreciate this, and I think many others do as well. In one of his most recent releases, when speaking on comms security, he made brief mention of how we should be aware of our own ignorance and what technology might be classified, what sort of technology the government might be able to use against us. This reminded me that I had recorded this very thing when I did some research a while back, and I should probably just release it. But I have no intention to create further divide on the subject in this presentation, nor do I wish to discourage any learning. That's learning of the equipment, learning of the methodologies, etc. I simply want to offer words of caution and create an avenue of additional research, as my own investigations have yielded information which I cannot, at my level of knowledge, simply disregard. In fact, if I understand it correctly, the information is exceedingly important. Yes, the title may be clickbait, but clickbait isn't always false advertising. Now for what I had previously recorded. But anyway, with that in mind, the reason I'm here today is to distribute some information that I think may be applicable to this community in general. What I have here is simply informational, and it's in the public domain. Most of us are concerned with the various nightmare scenarios that are discussed. Nuclear weapons, EMP from an airburst nuke, or simply even just a localized failure of electricity and authorities. These standard kinds of things that get discussed commonly in these communities. We've considered all sorts of forms of communications applicable to these particular events, but one of the most common resurgent discussions surrounds two-way radio communication. They've been ubiquitous for more than 100 years, and they've improved in technology substantially. We went from entire units not having but one radio to now anybody can just buy one for $50. There's a great many applications for these devices, and they're great tools to learn. I have to admit myself to being a noob with them, and I have a good deal to learn until I can use any of the modern stuff without any reference materials. That being said, many of us are also aware of their limitations and vulnerabilities as far as encryption, line of sight, hardware detectability when transmitting, etc. Detectability during transmission is a simple matter of signal strength triangulation. It's been a major means of navigation, especially in the air, for a long time. But during some free time the other day, I happened to wonder what exactly it would take to discover such a standard device when it was passively receiving, rather than just when it's transmitting. First, though, I had to understand the basic concepts behind what might be detectable, so I spent some time learning the ultra basics of the components of signal reception and translation to intelligible sound within the devices. And I have a bit of a scientific background, but it's not an electronic one, so for anybody interested, I'll try to keep it straightforward like I had to for myself. If I fail at that, let me know in the comments and I'll try to improve it in the future. Basically, modern radio receivers, modern being relative since this is like World War I tech, are what are called super heterodyne receivers. This just means that the frequencies received by the antenna are altered, filtered, and translated to what we can hear through the speaker in the headset. This is done by what is called heterodyning. Hetero from the Greek indicating different, and dyne for power, so different powers. Overlapping frequencies produce what we call beat frequencies in their overlap. Like a polyphonic overtone, it's produced from the constructive interference overlap in two tones in an instrument or when singing. You can go look up polyphonic overtone singing and you can hear what I mean. You can also hear it in tube and throat singing, like in The Who. Anyway, it produces a third tone, discernible from the other two. This heterodyning effect can be used in electromagnetic signals as well. That is, an incoming signal of one power is mixed inside the device with another signal of a different power. This allows for increased sensitivity while being able to modulate the effects of interference. This second signal, however, comes from within the device itself, from what's called the local oscillator. When the incoming RF signal is mixed with the frequency produced by the local oscillator, it makes an intermediate frequency. It's a more uniform frequency that can be used within the device. I'm sure there are musicians and audio and electrical engineers who will make what I've said more specific or correct any stumbling. Please do that. However, for the purposes of this video, the focus is on this local oscillator that's producing a second frequency. Both the frequency of this oscillator and the frequency of the missed signal are characteristics of the receiving device, like an EM band signature. Yep, All the devices have to pass those FCC tests and get those labels stuck on the back of them to make sure they don't unduly interfere with any other devices, but they're also supposed to be able to just accept whatever interference they do receive, so whatever. But this does not preclude the exploitation of electromagnetic leakage from the device for the purposes of detection, identification, or even location. To that end, in my exploration after discovering the basics, I was able to locate a couple of papers written about exactly this objective. The first is from a university in Spain, and it's a short paper that explains the concepts and difficulties. I'll link it in the description, but I didn't really dig into that one too much. It's only 4 pages long, and it's very, it's a broad brush. The second and more important paper, or series of papers, is a doctoral dissertation that really has 3 separate papers combined, each building on the previous one, directed at exploiting electromagnetic leakage in receiving devices to detect and characterize them. Before anyone considers that this may be a weak effort or directed in some feeble manner just because it's a university paper, because I know a lot of academic papers are, they're produced to get degrees. I'll say that the authors of this paper cited some of their other work and the work of others, which included using similar techniques with the purpose of discovery of electromagnetic receivers in improvised explosive devices, with a mind toward the conflict in Afghanistan at the time. So this is pretty relevant to what we generally talk about in the community. The thesis is entitled Detection of Low-Cost Radio Frequency Receivers Based on Their Unintended Electromagnetic Emissions and an Active Stimulation. Clearly, it's not trying to make it to the bestseller list with that title. But the first paper introduces a basic method of identifying a characteristic pulse from an EM device by analyzing the emissions of the device ahead of time. Sort of like fingerprinting a person. So you can look for them later, any evidence they leave behind. The detection of the relatively known signal was experimented with, and the authors were able to detect and distinguish characteristic emissions, that is the fingerprint, amongst other electromagnetic white noise. So they had an EM receiver at a distance, and they had already had it close up and had analyzed the signal that it gives off, and then just look for that signal at a distance while introducing electromagnetic white noise to an extent until they could no longer detect the characteristic signal that they had fingerprinted. The result of this first paper, is detection of the receiver at 40 meters with a probability of detection of about 98%. Okay, so that's significant just by itself. But they did have to have the actual receiver. They analyzed it in a pseudo-anechoic chamber. That is a chamber that's relatively insulated from noise signals. And then they placed it at a distance and just looked for it. So there's a little safety in that. Theoretically, if we're talking about what we're worried about, because not all of our devices are characterized. I'll say, however, that a great many of us don't have all that much money, so we tend to buy what everybody else has, those Baofeng V5Rs or whatever it is, the basic model. So what difficulty would be presented in characterizing a handful of those devices, or a great number of those devices, if this is the U.S. military, they characterize a whole slew of them, I don't know, 500 different devices, and they can average the EM signature that's emitted. So now they have a characteristic fingerprint, and they can apply it generally. But that might not be necessary. The second paper in the dissertation improves on this method by adding a stimulating signal, which the receiver picks up. By picking it up, it leaves fingerprints on its EM linkage again, but this time the fingerprints on the signal didn't have to be taken beforehand, the fingerprints on the leakage signal. Only the frequency range of emissions expected from the device are needed. Then the stimulating signal, consisting of a frequency pulse, is tailored to the band range expected of the device. The local oscillator is mixed with the inbound probing signal to create the device's characteristic intermediate frequency, which we already talked about, which is then leaked from the device and detectable to the researcher. Think of it like probing an object with a long pointy stick. The result of the application of this algorithm was a probability of detection of 96%, a 2% drop, in a signal white noise environment with a false positivity rate of 10%. But the ability to do this without necessarily first completely characterizing the receiver. So it's a slight improvement. Where it gets what I would consider to be creepy, being the third paper. By expanding the stimulation signal, the researcher was able to remotely detect and characterize the receiver. That is, without prior knowledge of the type or characteristics of the receiver, the application of a known stimulating signal directed by an algorithm, resulted in the detection of a radio receiver and characterization of the radio receiver. The results were that the modulated stimulation algorithm had a 94% probability of detection across 5 different receivers tested with a 0% false positivity rate at a range of 100 meters. Please note that this dissertation and research was completed by a student in 2009. There are limitations to this, obviously, especially as it's written at the time. The receiver line of sight is the biggest limitation. If the receiver doesn't have line of sight to the stimulating signal and the stimulator's receiver, the probability of detection is affected significantly. However, if we're going to apply this to a modern scenario and stick this thing on a drone, assuming it can be whatever receiving and processing capability can be carried on a little drone module, that would seem to drastically reduce the problems posed by line of sight. Also note that at the time the detection was limited to 100 meters. This is because the characteristic signal that's leaked by the device is low power by nature. Power output of that local oscillator is low. But I speculate that this could be affected to a limited extent by the amplitude of the stimulating signal. I could be wrong, but even if I am right, the output's going to be limited because the intent of that local oscillator isn't to create very high amplitude signals. So there's going to be some sort of physical limitation within the circuitry of the device. In any case, there's plenty more to investigate here, but it's one instance of my curiosity leading me exactly where I thought it might, but I didn't really want it to. Take this information for what it's worth. It's by no means intended to dissuade anyone from the use of the two-way devices, especially for appropriate communications in the event of these various aforementioned challenging scenarios. It is, however, a friendly reminder never to underestimate any potential. Remember, there is no liberty without virtue, and we are the Praetorians of the Republic.